Good to see everyone. It sounds like everyone is having an amazing reunion. I know if our panel moments ago was Stacy and James is any indication, we spent of the hour 45 minutes in great introductions and conversations, and then 10 minutes on the panel topic, which is great. There's just so much sharing. I think to me, the building the network and extending the network and thinking about things we can do together after this is the most wonderful thing. So I didn't introduce myself. My name is Michael Goldberg. I have two roles at the university. I'm a faculty member at Weatherhead where I teach entrepreneurship classes. And then I run a new institute that was set up about 5 years ago called the Veal Institute for Entrepreneurship, and that actually is physically located at ThinkBox. I'm so thrilled to be able to say a couple words and welcome everybody. Elizabeth, the Beamer is here. A quick greeting to her for everyone, and welcome. I was very touched that in the planning of this session with Dale and Mike, she suggested, because of my relationship with Richard and he touched so many people, that I kick this off and say a few words. I want to tell two Richard stories. One was, and I'll pose it as a question. When I first took a full-time position here, and Elizabeth, you may not even know the story, they gave me Richard's office. So here's the question. Why? That's what I was going to say. Why would they give me Richard's office that basically had cobwebs in it? Where was Richard? When he wasn't at home, where was he in the building? Downstairs, sitting in PBL, meeting with students. So why would Richard want an office on the second floor where he wasn't accessible? He was downstairs all the time. I mean, it was just like this spirit, and I would say for Peter and JB and a number of us, like this spirit of like being accessible. We work in an amazing building, but one of the hard parts about our building is actually like finding one another. And Richard had no patience to be found in his office and sat in the middle of the lobby and just held court. So that was inspiring. And the second comment I'll make, because we were just in O2 with Stacy and some folks, and many of you who had Richard when he taught at PBL, it was that room in the round. Someone actually asked, did Frank Gehry design this room for Richard? Which I'm not quite sure that happened, but I like to believe that it did. I mean, nobody worked a room like Richard. It's in the round. It was always hard to figure out kind of where to stand. And during some of Richard's final days of teaching, when he was in a wheelchair, being brought to the classroom, it was really unbelievable. And he was such a vibrant person and educator and personality. And I would watch him get brought to the room, really obviously not feeling his physical self, and then he would come alive like with students. So just feel so privileged to have been. He was a great mentor for me. Like Richard, I'm also not a traditional PhD educated tenure track professor. So Richard really paved the way to open the door to educators like us. So great to be part of this today. I will turn it over to Mike and Dale, who are going to run the show, but thank you for letting me kick things off today.
So good morning, everybody. Super happy to be here. Just to start this off, this idea came up several months ago, and I got to thinking about it, and it was like, okay, we're going to do this in honor of the gorilla who touched my life. I wouldn't be here if it wasn't for him. It wasn't for the EMBA program. And I was thinking, okay, how am I going to do this? So I got out my blue double-breasted suit coat, my two-boot New York shoes. So anyway, the whole point is I can't do it like the gorilla did, and I'm not even going to try. My name is Dale Schott, a.k.a. Roadrunner. That's the nickname I had in the gorillas class. I've had it ever since. I'm a O2 graduate of the EMBA program. I'm an import to Cleveland. I'm actually here because of this program, believe it or not. My background, I grew up in Wisconsin, family farm, 8 brothers and sisters, milking cows, the whole thing. Went to the UW, eventually went out to the West Coast. I was going to do the program at the University of Washington. I was going to do an EMBA program at the University of Washington. Company got sold. They said no EMBA program, and by the way, we might not have a budget for your position anymore. So I had an opportunity to come back to the Midwest, and my wife, who's EMBA 04, so we came back, and there was sort of a choice as to where we were going to live. And I knew I wanted to do an EMBA program. And my company said, you got to be in Ohio or Pittsburgh, and you know, you got to be in Ohio or Pittsburgh. And so I was like, okay, I like Pittsburgh, so we'll be in Pittsburgh or maybe Cleveland. And then my wife ended up getting a job, and she had some flexibility as to where she wanted to live as well. And they said, no Pittsburgh, either Columbus or Cleveland. So that's how we ended up here, is because of the EMBA program at Case. It's turned out to be unbelievable because we absolutely love living here. It's been a great place to raise our kids. The program has been unbelievable to me. I graduated. I actually did it with the Gorilla's inspiration. I was going to buy a business. I was 30 years old. I didn't have any business buying a business, but I thought I could buy a business. Spent 2 years trying to do that. Deal fell. I had several deals fall through. At the end of those 2 years, I had one that I thought was going to close. And we got pretty close to closing the deals. The company in alliance, they were doing about 20 million in sales. I had private equity lined up to back the deal. And my wife said, well, honey, what are you going to do if the deal falls through? And I said, oh, come on, we got the LOI signed. Deal's not going to fall through. We're all set. She said, well, what if it falls through? I said, it's not going to fall through. We're good to go. Well, on December 19th of 2004, and by this time I had left my job, so I wasn't working. What happens? The deal falls through. And what I had done is I had told her, I said, if the deal falls through, I'll start something. So I had committed to her that I would start a business. So on January 5th of 2005, I started a business. I'm in the paper and packaging industry, so we import highly specialized papers, things like tea filter paper, so your tea bag, the paper that gets used to make your tea in the morning, the wrapper that goes around your drinking straw. We import those types of things. We have a warehouse up in Northeast Cleveland. We distribute them throughout North America. We have some American products that we sell internationally. And then we bought a couple companies along the way, so we have a little factory down in Streetsboro that we bought that was doing some subcontracting for us, and so that's the story. So 3 kids, 17 years old, living in Shaker Heights, and love the MBA program and absolutely love Cleveland. So Fish, why don't you give us a quick intro here?
Well, first of all, thanks for having me here. And this school and this program are transformational, as we just heard. I think in my story, it's the same thing. So my story, which is, I tend to be long-winded, so I'll try to keep it short. Undergrad at West Point, I was a computer science major. I loved technology. I was commissioned into the Army on active duty as an aviation officer, so I went to flight school. I flew helicopters for about 7 years. This was in the early 90s, and there was no way to apply that technical background into the military. There was not a cyber branch or anything like that at the time. And I had this big decision to make about my 7th year of, do I get out or do I stay in? And I got out because I wanted to be a software developer. I had done some graduate work at that point, and I just wanted to program. So that's what brought me here to Cleveland. And I am the typical, I wanted to be in a dark room and just program behind a screen. That's where I'm most comfortable. And I did that for a couple of years. And I thought, okay, maybe someday I'll be an architect or something, but just this is really what I want to do. And then my manager at one point talked to me. She said, yeah, you've got all this management experience from the military and stuff, like you should be a manager. And she kind of tricked me into being a manager. And I call myself a reluctant manager still to this day. I just want to crawl back into my dark room. But I then quickly realized that I knew nothing about business, and that as a technologist, especially as a manager in technology, I had to know business. I had to know the language of finance and marketing and so forth. And so that's what brought me here to the EMBA program in 98. I graduated in 2000. And it transformed. It taught me so much that I've used as a manager in business. Met my wife here. We moved out to California. a friend of mine kept calling, saying this was early 2000s, like, this is where tech is, you got to come out here. And I kept resisting, like, no, no, no. Ended up going out to California. I was head of engineering for PayPal right after it got acquired by eBay. So really small team. I've got some wild stories from that time, both in the people and the personalities, but also in the technology and the scale. It was just growing so quickly that we were on the cutting edge and trying to figure out techniques and things that would work to keep the site running and the payments going. I loved it. I didn't never want to leave. And then a friend of mine said, come to New York and check out this startup for him. And I said, I'll do it for you. So I flew to New York, and it was a little ad tech startup that had started in Israel, but when they received their first funding, the deal was they had to move to the US as part of that. So 7 people packed up and moved to New York City, and they were looking for people who knew how to scale. And I literally remember on the flight back to California thinking, oh, ad tech, this was 2005. I'm like, ads on the internet, that's going to be a big thing. And it turned out it was. So I quit PayPal. We moved across the country to New York for this little startup. I was the chief technology officer. We grew that for a couple of years, competing with Google AdSense and AdWords. And then we sold it to AOL. And I should pause here and tell you about a framework that I use as I think about companies. Simon Wordley has a framework you might have heard of that he basically says there's this S-curve for companies. And he calls the early days pioneers. And that is when you're trying to find product market fits, the 0 to 1. And so you're this pioneer in the field. And then once you found that product market fit, then you go into scaling. And these he calls settlers. And that's when you're expanding, the town and you're settling. And then eventually when it levels off and you're just really extracting value out of it, he calls that town planning. And there's another framework that's very much like that S-curve by Kent Beck, but he uses 3 X's. So he calls it, you're exploring when you don't know what exactly is going to fit. You're expanding when you're scaling, and then you're extracting value at the top. So if you think about where I told you, I was in the military and then General Electric. These were in that extracting value phase. They were really large. They'd already scaled up. They were past their hypergrowth. Right? The military's, it's all about optimization. And so then I go to PayPal, and it was definitely in that scaling. It was growing so quickly. Things were just falling over left and right, trying to keep things up. And then I ended up in New York at this little startup that was still exploring. They didn't have product. They were still trying to find their product market fit. And so I've now started thinking about my career as how I've kind of worked backwards through this. I ended up, once that company sold, Quigo sold, I started another company with some friends, because we knew about scaling. And no one at the time really knew how to scale companies in the tech world this much. And so we said, there's an opportunity here. We found our product market fit pretty quickly, and we started scaling up, hiring employees. I did that for 10 years, and I met with 350 companies and taught them everything from scaling, and I've got a bit of a framework that I call people, process, and technology, but how to scale. It was all about whether you're a small startup trying to, the growth was overwhelming, or you're really big companies like we worked with, Intuit for TurboTax, because you can imagine the scale that tax season has on that, or Apple, the iTunes store, back when you used to get gift cards over the holidays in a massive scale. So anyway, we did that for a number of years. I ended up coming back for the PhD because I realized that consulting was teaching, and that's what I thought. I really wanted to be able to take that knowledge from research and apply it. So I did my PhD program, and I thought, I am just settled here. That's what I do. I'm a consultant. I do some teaching. And then, of course, as fate would have it, something changes. My plans are out the window. The world changes. So a small company that I had been consulting with called Etsy, who had gone through that scaling phase, did a leadership transformation and brought me back in as a fractional CTO, and then said, would you ever stay? I said, I love this company, in part because it's for entrepreneurs. And I call them creative entrepreneurs. These are people, artists, craftspeople, who they're entrepreneurs of one that sometimes scale up and end up with hundreds of people and get massive distributions. So I love the company. I love the idea. So I thought I was going to spend 2 years with them. I ended up spending 6 years with them and left, in part because I argue that they went from that scaling, which we helped them scale, up to a little bit of value extraction. And I've realized over my career that I find that kind of boring, that phase. Some people love it, great. I find it a little bit boring. I am squarely in I love to scale things up. There's a lot of fires during that phase. There's a lot of challenges, so I love that. Anyway, and then I left there and was looking around again in a twist of fate. I was looking for a technology. I've been a chief technology officer sort of most of my career. That's what I love to do. And an opportunity came up to be a CEO. And again, I was like, well, this is going to be another challenge and pushed me to learn. And so I took on, 2 years ago, the CEO of MyFitnessPal, which if you don't know, it's a nutrition tracking app. It's actually probably much larger than you can imagine. We've got 300 million registered users. We've been around for 20 years. We're top 40 grossing app in the App Store. It's kind of a little quiet app that hangs out there, but it ends up being really, really large scale, and it's been a lot of fun. So again, thanks for having me here, and hope we have a great conversation.
Yeah, totally looking forward to it. Before we get into the conversation, I should tell everybody the way the gorilla would have done it is the way we're going to do it today. So at the end, we're going to do the top 10 takeaways from this discussion. And if people don't raise their hand, I will call on you and call you out. So we'll do top 10 takeaways for the last 10 minutes of the program. So Fish, you mentioned people, processes, and technology. Can you share a little bit about that? And can you point to any specific times during your career where maybe you got that right or maybe you got it wrong and how that led to kind of where you are today?
Yeah, I've used that framework in scaling. As I think about the early days of companies, though, I do think the people side of that is most important. And I learned that from PayPal, that they were they hired the brightest people they could. They didn't actually care if you could code. They're like, we can teach you to code. We can teach you the language. They wanted really, really bright people. And the engineers that I had, again, it was a very small team, about 35 when I joined. And they were some of the smartest people I've ever worked with. And they could solve anything that they put their mind to. And they weren't always the easiest to work with, but they could solve anything. And at the early stages, that was really important. And then what I find is when you're in the scaling phases, I think of them as three knobs: people, process, and technology. And when you think about people, it's certainly individuals, but it's also things like organization structures and reportings and things like that. So it's more than just an individual. It's how teams are structured. Process, obviously, it's everything from how you deploy software to how you do your annual planning. And then the technology is the product, but it can also be internal, right? So what tools you're using internally to help facilitate this. And when you're scaling, you've constantly got to be adjusting all three of those. If you get them wrong, for instance, if you get process wrong and you don't put enough process in place when you're scaling up, you end up with the Wild West. And things are just however anybody wants to do it. If you get it too far to process before you're ready for it, it's bureaucracy, right? You start to put in a process that's overwhelming for a small team. And so you've got to constantly be tweaking that based on how large your company, your employee base is. So I think that is how I think about the world. What I got wrong for so long, because as a leader, I've always thought people are so, so important. And I still think they are. But I've realized lately that you have to fish in the right pond. And Warren Buffett says, when a management team with a reputation for brilliance meets a business that has a reputation for bad economics, it's the business reputation that remains intact. And so what he's saying is that you can have the most brilliant people and that are able to do the best things. If you're in a company that's not in the right pond, you're fishing in the wrong pond, you're not going to succeed. And so I think that's been one of the things that I've really realized. I've been very fortunate to pick some of those right ponds at the time. Like I mentioned, ads in 2005 are going to be a big thing. Fortunately, I've picked some good ponds to fish in. And I think that's really, really important. It's something that I did not know for a long time.
What about at MyFitnessPal? What was that? It's a large company. I think you undersold it a little bit when you talked about it. And knowing you, that I'm not surprised by that. But how did that play in as a new leader at MyFitnessPal at an organization that large?
Certainly, I think about the people, process, technology. But even before then, like as I was considering the opportunity, I look at the industry and think of something like, is this industry growing? And coming out of the pandemic, this industry is actually shrinking. But what happened was, and a bit of a unexpected result from this is the introduction of GLP-1s into weight loss has actually been a huge tailwind. People were initially very concerned in this industry of health and fitness and weight loss and so forth that GLP-1s would actually crush this business. And if I could just take a pill, why do I need to change my behavior and track and so forth? It's actually raised awareness. So even though 10% of the population, at least in the U.S., is on some form of this, it's raised awareness across everybody, and it's grown the industry. And another thing is when you're the largest, the number one company in the industry, when the industry rises, it doesn't raise all boats. That tide does not raise all boats evenly. It benefits the largest company in there. And so again, like it matters the industry that it's rising, that where you're positioned in that. All that I sort of took into account. And the GLP-1s actually turns out, and we've done studies and people are realizing this, that they benefit enormously when they track nutrition alongside of it. You get less side effects, you actually lose more weight, you stay on the regimen longer, and it's a perfect partner to that. So all of those have actually been like, as I looked at this company and studied the industry, like it's actually been a growing industry and a good time to be in this space.
And you mentioned something there that if to put it differently, as the pie grows, MyFitnessPal does well, right?
That's right.
So does MyFitnessPal then make an effort to grow the size of the pie, or do you just let it happen organically?
No, it's a great question that when you're the majority player in something, you can spend your money to grow the entire pie because you disproportionately benefit. If you're a smaller player, you can't do that. And so you need to think about more of the more performance marketing that's directed. But there's a book called How Brands Grow. If you haven't read it, I highly recommend it, that talks about this concept that when you're the largest, you disproportionately benefit. And so you should actually look at growing the entire market because it'll benefit you.
Very interesting. Interesting. So you've also written, so if for those of you who don't know, Fish has a Substack out there called Fish Food, and I've been devouring it over the past few months. Super fascinating. So you've talked in your Substack about a portfolio theory for leadership. Can you tell us a little bit about that and how you leverage that theory in your leadership?
Yeah, just like we were talking about the sort of the S curve. The S curve can be applied to companies of like what stage of company, but it also can be applied to like product lines that hopefully, a really solid company has products that are in the explore stage. Some are in that expansion phase, and then some you're just extracting value. You're not really putting a lot of development into. And so I think about from a product development perspective that you need a portfolio of bets. And, generally, you can do optimization work, which is the short-term results, and then you can do longer-term work, which is more that 0 to 1, finding that product market fit. If you put too much of your eggs in any of those baskets, it's a huge risk. And so I bring, one of my thoughts about product development is you've got to treat it like you would an investment portfolio. You can borrow from a lot of different, areas, even betting. And like, how do you make the right bets? And you certainly don't want to go all in all the time. There's a lot of risk and danger to that. And so as you think about your portfolio of product developments, it could be you're working on one product and placing 80% of your bets on optimizations because they're going to give the high rate of return, 20% on stuff that's a little bit lower likelihood. But you've got to place that. If you go too far to one side, then you tend to get stuck. I'm full of opinions, of course, as you can probably tell. I have a whole lot of opinions about public companies and what the pressure of quarterly results do to that product portfolio mix. And it tends to push them into this optimization work as opposed to really long-term bets. Unless they're really big companies, they can stand up to the market. But yeah, that's my thoughts on product.
And how does that work in real life? I mean, are you actually doing game theory and saying this product has a 10% chance of success and this optimization has an 80% chance of success and a 32% return and calculating it out, or is it not that detailed?
No, we do, but we even back up and say that if any company so everything we do in software, and probably almost every company that's in software does A/B test. So you test everything that goes out. So you have a control group that you leave the same, and then you put your changes out, and you measure the impact. And the nice thing about software, which hardware is obviously a little bit harder to do this with, but software, I can do that relatively quickly. And everything that I do gets tested that way. Well, anybody who publishes the results of those experiments will show that only about 10 to 15% are positive. So that means the other 85 or 90% are either neutral, they do nothing to the customer experience, or they're actually harmful. And the reason for this is that you've got, and by the way, these are really smart product managers who come up with these ideas. It's not like random, they're not throwing random stuff out there. The reason is the product managers and everybody in this company is so close to the product. We are not typical users, right? I use the product, I'm in the product 8 hours a day, 10 hours a day. Product managers are even more. We have customers that are using it for 30 seconds. They try to track food while they're on the drive to work or on the train to work while they're getting their kids ready. We are not, as a product team, we're not. We also are very small. There's a couple hundred of us in the company. We have 15 million active users monthly. Like, we're not going to represent them. We're also massively international. We're not going to be able to represent them with our small team. So you got a brilliant idea, you're going to do it out there, 10% chance that it's going to work. That's on the best of it. And so you've got to think about that experiments. What that means is you need massive velocity of test. You've got to have a huge velocity of test. So even when you're doing these bigger bets, which often take a longer time, trying to break those down and testing to iterate your way into this. And so yes, we think about it from both a portfolio that we know 80 to 90% of our stuff isn't going to work, isn't going to be a positive change for our customers. We know that. This is, by the way, data from Google, Microsoft. We saw the same thing. I saw it at Etsy. We saw it at MyFitnessPal. All of these companies, we see the same results. So it's not uncommon. You've got to be super high velocity of changes, testing, because you don't know what's going to work. And it should be a mix of all that stuff. And yes, we analyze the risk and likelihood of all of it.
But if you're only succeeding 10% of the time, then you're failing 90% of the time. So you've got, and I don't want to put words in your mouth, don't take this wrong, but you almost have a culture of failure, but you need it in order to succeed.
You do. It's one of the hardest things, right? You get people who go through school and, if you got a 10% on a test, like that's not, you're repeating that. It's a huge failure. You've got such, as we educate people, you've got such a culture of success. And these are high, you hire people because they're so successful in college and universities and their schoolwork, and yet they've got to fail and they've got to be comfortable with failing. And so the difference that we try to teach them is that it's okay to fail if you're doing it in a 2-week sprint. It's not okay if we spend 2 years building something, we don't talk to our customers at all, and we launch it and it doesn't work. That's a huge investment. Break it down into something very, very small, get it out there, let the customers test it. And then we now, Evan and Dale and I were talking at the beginning with AI, we can, in the morning, work with a product team on an idea, have a prototype that we, in the afternoon, walk out to the street with gift cards and have people interact with. And we say, we'll give you a coffee gift card if you'll interact with the screen and tell me what you think about it. That is how fast we can iterate. And that, if you fail and you go, no one liked my design, I try again the next day. And that is not a failure. That's a learning. And so you've got to teach people that it's okay to fail this way if you're learning from it.
So we're in a room of high-powered executives, people who are leading teams. And in order to fail like that, you kind of have to be a little bit vulnerable. So I guess my question is, how do you model that vulnerability? How do you grow that culture so that people are comfortable with failure? How do you model it?
I think, especially as leaders, we think we have to have all the answers. And you really don't. In fact, we probably should take a lesson to like be quiet more often and listen to people, get their input. But we typically have grown up thinking like, oh, the leader knows everything, they've got all the answers. And I think we've got a model that it's okay. We don't have to have the answers. I think you could do stuff like say, I don't know more often, or here's what I know and here's how I'm thinking about it. Bring people in to join. Let them see that you don't have all the answers. Or when you are wrong, say, that's on me. And get people comfortable. We've done things like we call them Failure Fridays, where we go around and we share a failure from your past. And we get people comfortable to normalize this idea that like if we're learning from it, it's okay.
Wow, that's super powerful. I can't imagine a lot of companies, I can't imagine a GM or something going around and having a Failure Friday and celebrating a bunch of failures. That's I mean, it's kind of crazy.
Yeah. You got to get really used to it and teach people that it's okay to fail if you're learning from it, because that's what's going to ultimately make you succeed. You think about a professional sports team, right? The players on the field are missing passes and they're missing tackles and they're not scoring, and they do that over and over and over, and they're missing their shots on goal ultimately so that they can win, because hopefully every time they do that they're learning, oh, this player likes to cut left, or I kicked the ball a little bit too far to the right, next time I got to take account for the wind or whatever. All of those things, if I'm learning from them, ultimately the team, which is the company, wins if you're willing to learn. And I think a lot of our athletes have realized that it's okay to struggle and fail, because ultimately they're going to win because of it.
Is it harder today in the fast-paced world, social media? Does that make being vulnerable and modeling failure harder?
Oh, I am sure, yes, that in our social media we see perfection, right? We only see the sunny side, and you see it with companies as well, and we do it. I'm sure everyone else, like when we announce our summer release, which is just the amalgamation of all the changes we've made kind of in the last 6 months. They're all successes. We rarely talk about like, oh, by the way, to get to these 6 successes, we had to have 60 failures that didn't work. We've got experiments out the wazoo that like didn't show any progress, and we try and try again. So we are the same way as everyone else. We don't share that.
How does it interact with excellence? I think about Steve Jobs and the iterations he would go through to make the tiniest changes to every product that he developed, because he wanted that type of excellence. But it almost seems like this failure and being vulnerable, those two things are almost opposite each other.
I think a lot of great leaders can hold both of those concepts in and actually succeed as a leader with that, and having great empathy for failure, but also not tolerating anything less than excellence. And one of the stories that come to mind with this, there was a Colonel, Robert Cole, in World War II. He led, I think it was the 503rd Parachute Team. This is when airborne and parachuting in was really, really brand new. And he parachuted in on D-Day with his unit. And during that fight, he actually led a bayonet charge in World War II, which earned him the Medal of Honor. So they used this like amazing military leader, but they called him out, not because of all that bravery and stuff, but because they said he is the example of someone who cares and swears. So they say he's a caring and swearing leader. And one of the stories that they tell about him was he was going around doing inspections one night, and he found a guard asleep, which is very dangerous, obviously. And they described it as they kind of chewed him out, up and down, so bad. I'm sure he was cursing his relatives and everything else. The soldier was crying. The soldier was left crying after this. And then he did something. He literally, Colonel Cole took off his poncho and gave it to the soldier so he could stay warm and dry over the guard duty. And that's what this example is of like somebody that is going to hold you to super high standards. I don't recommend that you swear or cheer your team up, but like hold them to super high standards. At the same time, be super empathetic about it's okay to fail, and to teach people that like, yes, you can be vulnerable with me. And I think that's what we need. The best leaders do that.
Well, and you brought up the Army, which is, I guess call it a mature organization. That'd be probably fair, right?
Yes.
So is it different with a mature organization versus a startup, a big business versus a small business? I mean, does that play into it as well?
I think leadership matters no matter what. And that whether you're a small startup, and by the way, I make a very distinct difference between managers and leaders and say that clearly managers a role, something you manage people or projects. Leaders, everybody in our organization should be a leader. And we should be displaying leadership as whether you're an individual contributor or on the executive team. So everybody, even at startups, should be leaders. And you should show that empathy, but high standards. And I think whether that's the military or a startup, I think leadership really matters. Good leadership matters.
Okay, so you've mentioned people as being the one of the three that really matters. And you've mentioned that you have to have this culture of vulnerability and failure and being able to pick yourself up off the ground. So that takes a certain type of person. So you have to hire a certain type of person for this. So at the same time, you've written things about curiosity being more important than necessarily the pedigree or the experience or the education. How does that all mix into this? How do you fold these things into your hiring process when you're trying to identify people who can be the next leaders, because you want leaders up and down the organization?
I mentioned that people, especially in the early days, are so important, and I called out the PayPal team for being just really, really brilliant. And you see, like, this is, a lot of them were part of that PayPal mafia. If you haven't heard that term, the early people that went on to do the great things, like people on that 35-person team went on to lead Reddit and start YouTube and just do all these amazing things. So people really, really matter. And you're right, the intelligence is there, but the curiosity has to be there. And one of my friends shared this story with me that I thought was just brilliant about the curiosity. So he owns and runs a local manufacturing plant. And I was talking to him and I said, so you must hire a lot of mechanical engineers to like help with this. And he's like, no, not really. And he's like, we have a program where we bring in people who haven't gone to college and we train them ourselves. I was like, oh, okay, then you must have this like amazing test you give them to see like their aptitude. And they're like, no, we walk the floor with them. I'm like, what do you mean? And so he goes on to tell me that like they take this group of people and they walk around the manufacturing floor. And the ones that grab the parts and like look at it and are trying to figure out like, how did you make this? They're the ones that have enough curiosity to be hired and to be trained in their program. And so I thought that was just like such a great example of when you find that natural curiosity, they just want to know how the world works and how does this work. And you find that with, I would say like, we are just solving customer problems. If you solve customer problems, everything else takes care of itself. But you've got to be curious about what those problems are and how to solve them. As I mentioned, your ideas aren't going to work a lot of the time. You just got to be so curious to keep going about, okay, if my customer's having a problem logging a food, how do I solve that problem? Well, let me try changing this. Let me try changing the order of search results. That didn't work. Let me try their favorite foods at the top. Maybe that'll work. Oh, let me try and putting an image by it. You just got to be so curious about how do I solve that customer's problem? And that's what you should look for in my opinion, in your interviews. It drives so much and keeps them motivated to like continue working for your customers.
Do you've got any examples at MyFitnessPal or Etsy where you either hired somebody who had that spark and they didn't necessarily have that background or that perfect resume, or conversely, somebody who did have the perfect resume, you hired them and you're like, oh, this person's just not curious?
Absolutely have made hiring mistakes in large part because of not that curiosity, the culture, just the passion for. I think that we at Etsy we talked a lot about that passion of just care so much about, and primarily the seller. Certainly the buyers are important, but like caring so much. And so we would take people, the same thing, who had no program experience and send them through boot camps, but they had the passion and they were going to do anything they could because they loved this space. They loved, like I did, these creative entrepreneurs. And so we would take people who were from very non-traditional backgrounds. We had attorneys who said, I don't want to practice the law, I want to learn how to code. And we'd help them go through a local boot camp in New York. and then join us. So absolutely, we've done that a ton at companies that I've been with, is just looking for that passion. Like I mentioned at PayPal, they didn't actually care if you could program. We could teach how to program. We want your intelligence and your curiosity.
Super interesting. I'm going to change the topic just a little bit because you've also written things about the fallacy of being self-made, about how luck plays into our career, how good fortune plays into our career. Could you talk about that a little bit? Because that's something that I think a lot of people overlook. Everybody likes to think, oh, I did this with because I work really hard, because I'm really smart, I have these skills, et cetera, et cetera. Could you touch on that?
Sure, and I certainly don't want to take away from anyone's success, because you've obviously worked hard and taken risk. But I also think that we forget how lucky we are at times. We've stumbled into that right pond to fish in. One example for me is that just the Power Network. And I say about like a huge benefit of going through school is the network. That's why I think these types of reunions are so important, is to keep those relationships and build new ones. Immensely important. The only job I've ever just interviewed for cold was the very first one out of the military. I went to a hiring conference, GE happened to be there, and I interviewed. Every other one, somebody has said, you should come out here, introduce me, give me and I mean every single one. Like, it's the power of the network. And some have come through school, some have come through personal friendships and stuff. And so, you can't forget that you're given opportunities because of other people. And I think oftentimes you look back, you've put in so much work and you've done so much, you've taken the risk, you forget that other very, very important part, that there's a lot of luck that we've all experienced to be here. We happen to be lucky that we're in this country, and that we've got friends that are doing this, and we're able to take this risk, because certainly entrepreneurship and some of this stuff is a huge risk for people to leave corporate jobs. Like you quit your job and took a huge risk without only with an LOI. And so you've personally seen this, and I think it's worked out, and that's amazing. But I think we can't forget. And I think what that does, the reason I care so much about making sure people remember that there's a bunch of luck involved in this, is the best leaders are humble, and they understand that the organization and the success of the organization matters more than their personal success. And that's not, it's hard to find executives that always think that way, but I think that is the ideal. And I don't claim that I always think that way, but I think that's the ideal that we should shoot for, is to be humble enough to realize that I don't build a product. I've got engineers that are brilliant, and they build the product, and product managers. It is the team by far that help this company be successful. I just happen to get to go around talk about it, which is fun. But there's hundreds of people that actually do the hard work that maybe don't get all the credit. I'm very, very, very fortunate for that. And I think that's the ideal leader, is someone who's humble and understands that the needs of the organization are more important. And so that's.
As an example, I've always said there's somebody watching over me, because I've had crazy, crazy things happen. Things fall into my lap. I ended up here in Cleveland out of luck, really. And that led to I came for the EMBA program, but the EMBA program, I didn't know a soul. We didn't know anybody when we landed in the city. And the EMBA program led to a world of friends, led to, for me, an entrepreneurial career. That led to Promise Partners. Promise Partners helped me along as far as my acquisition search. And then in those early days, when I was out looking for a company to buy, and when I was starting my own company, the number of executives in this city, it was amazing. I had business leaders taking, I would call them up and say, hey, can I just pick your brain for 15 minutes over coffee? I was a 30-year-old kid with not much money and not enough experience, but I was going to do something. And they're like, sure, I'll have coffee, and you should talk to this person and talk to that person. I mean, there is really, I do believe there is a lot of luck involved. Can you point to any specific example in your career, and that, things that got you to this point that were sort of luck and fortune, had a lot to play?
As I mentioned, every single job that I've had is because a friend either told someone to talk to me or recommended me or something like that. My story of going out to Silicon Valley, I was at GE here in the late 90s, and my friend was out there and said, "You got to come out here." And I was like, "No, no, no, no." Probably one of the worst economic decisions I ever made. Um, but ultimately it worked out. And a couple years later, I went out there, all because he kept after me and said, "You got to come here." I mean, Quigo was another example. They happened to be looking for someone who knew how to scale technology, because serving billions of ads they knew was going to be massively scalable. Now you could say that, like, oh, I had the right knowledge, but like it was all fortuitous and luck that led to that. So I think time and time again, Etsy, I happen to be a consultant that literally a friend of mine, had said, oh, when they were still starting to scale up, introduced us, and that's how I met them. Like, it's just over and over, I can point to people who have people and circumstances that have, like you said, kind of fallen in my lap and been super helpful. And I think all of us shouldn't forget about, we mentioned Cleveland and just how network friendly Cleveland is. I was telling Dale about a friend of mine who is out looking for entrepreneurship through acquisition, looking for a business to buy, and he's taken a couple of years, and he said it's been the most delightful experience of his life, because everybody in Cleveland, from person you meet on the street to CEOs, are willing to stop what they're doing and meet with you and talk about, share experiences and make introductions. And I think you can't forget that. We can't forget that, like, this, the whole concept of entrepreneurship through acquisition started from this school, and you're all part of that. So hopefully you're immensely proud and feel very fortunate that you're here, both within the school and the city.
What about scaling? So you've talked about scaling, and you said companies bring you in for your ability to scale. What are the tricks to implementing and I know there's a lot to it, but are there just one or two or maybe three things you can point to that you can say when you're trying to, I know we're trying to put in systems to scale up at my company, and it's hard. So are there a couple of points of advice that you could give regarding scaling and scalability?
So I do think when you're scaling, you've got to constantly be tweaking that, like, people, process, technologies, changing the org. Or do you have the right person in the right role? Do we have the right level of process in? That's important. But when I think about scaling companies, you have to be transforming. All companies, especially as you're going through that hyper growth phase and scaling, you have to be transforming. And a huge portion of companies fail transformations. And it is difficult because people and processes have inertia. They just want to stay doing the same thing they did yesterday. They want to do the TPS reports, right, the same way they did. It's so hard. And what it takes, back to the leadership, to change a company and to transform it takes, I like the Jim Collins level 5 leader. You can use whatever framework you want, but, like, he says this, the first one is like, you're a good contributor. Second one is you're a good team member. You're a good manager. Finally, you're a seasoned executive. But to be a level 5 leader has to be someone who is humble, but has immense amount of willpower. So you're humble because it doesn't matter your personal success. It matters the organization's success. And this transformation has to work for that to be successful. And then you've got such an immense amount of willpower, because you'll push, and then all of a sudden stuff will start sliding back. Do I have time for a quick story?
Yeah.
All right, so one of my quick stories. So when I first joined Etsy in 2017, they were still in data centers. They weren't migrated to the cloud. So everything from the website was run out of 2 data centers. And it wasn't like a failover data center, which is what you'd hope it would be. Like, they ran in one, you could fail it over. No. They'd have both up and running in order for the site to be available, which is very dangerous. And they did it all because they didn't have a capacity. In fact, one of the stories, when I first got there, they were standing up this thing called a Hadoop cluster, and it's going to be 400 nodes of this new Hadoop cluster. The old one was maxed out at complete capacity. It had taken a full year to get the budget approval for this, to get it ordered, to get it set up. They turned on this brand new 400 node cluster, and in 24 hours, it was at max capacity. So I walked into this and I said, we are never going to get ahead of this. We have got to get to the cloud, right? The cloud gives us infinite scale, as much compute as we want. And so, but the challenge was for Etsy, it was a monolith, meaning it wasn't broken up into service. So it was all one giant code base, one giant service. and it was written in PHP, which if you're not technical, PHP is not very performant. It's very slow. So other languages like C and C++ are very, very fast, or Java. PHP is notoriously slow. So there were engineers who said, look, in our data centers, we measure latency between our servers, not in seconds, not in milliseconds, in microseconds. So fast, because we control the network, we control everything about it. They said there's no way we're going to run in a public cloud where the latency is at least milliseconds, sometimes full seconds. It's like there's no way. But they also had this concept. They're like, we do hard things. They literally, of course, they're handmade signs, but they literally had handmade signs around the office that said, we do hard things. They said, we're going to do it. So we started in January of 2018 down this process of migrating out of the data centers into the cloud. And I remember a couple months into it, we're in this room, and an engineering manager is giving an update, and just this big technical problem came up. And I remember thinking in my mind, I'm like, this is it. This is when they tell me, like, I told you so. This isn't going to work. We can't do this. And a young engineer named Rebecca, I remember her, stood up in the back of the room and said, we could do this. And everybody kind of thought about it, chatted a bit, and they said, that's a good idea. We could do this. That was fine. But what she did next was just remarkable, I think. She said, but you know what? Next week we have another problem, and we're going to solve it. And the week after that, we have another problem, and we're going to solve it. And we're going to keep doing this until we migrate to the cloud. And she literally, just in that moment, that sheer will of like, we're going to do this, this young engineer just pushed the team forward. And I saw this time and time again through that process of leaders at every level. This was an individual contributor all the way up to our vice presidents. Every once in a while, would have to show that immense amount of willpower that we're going to get this done. When we first rolled to the cloud, we were doing it overnight in August of that year, and it didn't work. And we had leaders who had to step in and go, we're going to do this. Don't get depressed, don't get sad. We are going to figure this out. And I just kept seeing that time and time again. And so that's what it takes when you're scaling up, is you have to transform. And to transform is very difficult because you have inertia. So you need leaders with such willpower that it's going to get done.
Super fascinating. So I'm going to open it up for a question or two from the crowd, and then we're going to do the top 10 takeaways. Does anybody out there have a question for Fish? And I'm standing up so I can see the name tags better. Mad Dog.
Do you remember most fondly, or something that's very impactful from Gorilla's class that stuck with you and that you apply today?
Yeah, I actually was unfortunate. I did not take his class. So unfortunately, I don't have that.
Yeah, so I did have the Gorilla. And, the amazing thing was he did the class, and there were three kind of sections. The first section was about entrepreneurship through acquisition. That was like 4 weeks or something. The next section was on sheer entrepreneurship, and then the third section was on leadership, and leadership through the lens of an entrepreneurial business. But what was amazing is at the end of the summer, or at the end of the semester, he set up a time with every student in that class, and there were probably 40 or 50 students, and he took an hour, and he said, everybody is coming to see me. We're going to sit down and talk for an hour. And I came and I had all of my ideas, and he was sort of giving me ideas. I think in his head, he knew I probably wasn't prepared. He asked me how much money I had to buy a business. He didn't really tell me I couldn't do it, but he didn't necessarily tell me I could. And so I was out trying to do it anyway, because I was going to do it come hell or high water. But it was taking that extra. And then actually, as I was finding businesses, I had him and I had a number of other mentors that I actually called. Some that I had met through Promise Partners. And the Gorilla would give me advice. There was actually, so that's kind of what the Gorilla did. There was one specific mentor in Promise. His name was Ken Thompson. He was about 70 years old. And when I was looking for a business, he just kept telling me, Dale, just get in the business, or just get in the game. You got to be in the game. And I said, Ken, the business isn't big enough. I said, I'm going to be in there. I'm going to be doing it all myself. There's nobody to lead. There's no infrastructure. There's nothing. He said, Dale, just get in the game, do something. And it was his advice as well as the Gorilla's advice. and this idea that I'm not going back to work for a big company because I was really I just didn't like working for a big company. So, yeah, a lot of the things were transformational. I can think of other things. The saying, you got to have the wind at your back, meaning you got to be in a market that's growing, helps, and all of these different things that I still think of a lot of these sayings today as they come up. So
If I knew what I knew now, you couldn't have kept me out of that class.
any other questions? Okay, we're going to roll into top 10 takeaways then. So this is the way the gorilla had done it. Who's got a takeaway? Limousine liberal.
You got to fish in the right pond.
Now I can see it. Who's got another one?
Curiosity.
Curiosity. Higher for curiosity. Milkman.
Humbleness.
Coco.
Everyone should be a leader in an organization.
Yeah.
And I can't see your name tag.
Mudman.
Mudman.
How do you know when to scale or when to bail?
And way in back, I can't see your name tag. So
Booze.
who's?
Consulting is educating.
I can't see that one either. Chinese.
The cruise director.
The cruise director.
Celebrate learning from failure.
Dr. J.
Minimize failure by small scaling.
Bucky.
Balance people, process, and technology.
And Sunny.
Demand excellence, but lead with compassion.
Okay, the other thing that the gorilla always did, he always taught us that the greatest compliment you can give somebody is a standing ovation. So standing ovation, let's give it up for Chris.